Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that the very foundations of trust and safety in the Hamilton household are about to collapse in ways no one could have anticipated. As a simple medical emergency spirals into a nightmarish confrontation with a faceless adversary lurking in the shadows. Bill Hamilton had always been the picture of robust-heeled and avid jogger, a dedicated family man, and a pillar of stability for his daughter, Naomi, and his new wife, Hayley. Yet beneath his affable exterior, a secret gnawed at him, one he guarded jealously from everyone he loved. His hand shook with an ominous tremor whenever he tried to grasp a coffee mug, the tremor that signaled a creeping illness he refused to acknowledge aloud. He had hidden the sign from Naomi during her last visit, blinking away her questions about why he winced whenever he bent down to tie his shoelaces. He had even managed to deceive his closest friend, Dr. Patel, during a routine checkup last month, assuring the physician with a practiced smile that he felt fine. But the truth, as it often does, refused to stay buried indefinitely. As dusk settled on a Thursday evening, Bill's condition took a sudden and frightening turn. He was seated at the dinner table, Hayley across from him, Naomi's adoption paperwork spread out beside her plate, when a wave of dizziness swept over him. His fingers fumbled the fork, the trembling that had once been a mild quiver in his palm now rising to a full-bodied shake. Hayley's eyes widened as the knife rattled against his plate. She reached for his hand, concern etched on her face, but Bill yanked his hands away, masking the panic behind a forced laugh. "I think I just overdid it at the gym today," he murmured, voice unsteady as he stood abruptly, chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The air in the room shifted as Naomi looked up from her papers, her brow creasing. She had grown used to her father's occasional bluster, but the tremor that ran through his arm now told her this was more than mere fatigue. Hayley's gaze darted between Bill and Naomi, confusion giving way to dread. "Dad, are you okay?" Naomi asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Bill forced a reassuring smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just felt a bit off. Might head to bed early." He excused himself and retreated to his study, leaving Hayley and Naomi exchanging uncertain glances. Even as Bill closed the study door, leaning heavily against the frame and taking a breath that rattled through his chest, he felt the weight of his deception intensify. He knew that if he didn't come clean, the consequences could be catastrophic. But there was no time for confessions, not tonight, because an even darker presence was already stalking him through the corridors of his own home. It was almost midnight when the first sign of intrusion manifested in a sound so soft it could have been mistaken for the creak of wooden floorboards settling. Bill was dozing in his study chair, a thin sheet covering his legs as he tried to quell the chill of fever he claimed he didn't have. The house was silent save for the hum of the central heating and the distant sound of Hayley's soft breathing in their bedroom. Then, a shadow detached itself from the darkness beyond the doorway. At first, Bill thought it might be his imagination, a trick of the dim light that seeped through the half-closed blinds. But as the figure stepped forward, the long folds of a black cloak swallowed whatever feeble lamplight illuminated the room. The intruder moved with a predatory silence, each step measured and deliberate, as if savoring the moment before the strike. Bill's pulse caught in his throat, his trembling hand lurching for the antique brass paperweight on the desk of family heirloom he had inherited from his grandmother, hoping against all reason that he could defend himself. The attacker paused just beyond the threshold, cloak swirling like a living thing. Bill realized too late that his illness had weakened him more than he admitted. As he reached out to switch on the desk lamp, the figure lunged, arm outstretched, a glint of metal catching the light for a split second. Bill's scream was cut short as a gloved hand clamped over his mouth, and the paperweight clattered to the floor, forgotten. The assault was swift, a blow to the head that sent bells ringing in Bill's ears, followed by the sharp sting of a blade grazing his collarbone. He tasted blood in his mouth, felt the coldness spreading under his shirt, and sensed the world lurching off its axis. In those seconds of blinding pain, he realized with horrifying clarity that his illness may have been a convenient cover story, but this assault was no mere accident or robbery. The cloaked figure stood over him, silhouette framed by the dim light, breathing heavily behind the hood, as though savoring the terror in Bill's eyes. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the assailant dissolved back into the darkness, leaving Bill crumpled on the floor, heartbeat ragged, consciousness fraying at the edges. Upstairs, Hayley stirred from sleep, her intuition prickling with unease. She rose and walked toward their bedroom door, but as she reached for the handle, her phone buzzed with an urgent text from Naomi. "Is Dad okay?" He sounded terrible on the phone. Hayley's heart spiked. She had promised to call Naomi after dinner to update her about Bill's sudden illness, but the chaos of the evening had left both mother and daughter distracted. Instinctively, she clutched her phone and slipped down the stairs toward the study, her feet silent on the carpet, dread pooling in her stomach. She passed the kitchen, where a half-finished cup of tea on the counter quivered in its saucer, forgotten in Bill's departure. The house, moments ago alive with the hum of conversation, now felt like a mausoleum of waiting shadows. As she reached the study threshold, a whisper of movement caught her eye, a black shape flitting across the room's periphery, vanishing behind the heavy drapes that hung over the bay window. Hayley's breath hitched. She flicked on the study lamp, illuminating the wreckage, the paperweight on the floor, Bill's briefcase overturned, important documents scattered in disarray. And then she saw him, Bill, lying prone on the floor, eyes half-lidded, a pool of crimson spreading beneath him. "Bill," she screamed, and her heart slammed against her ribs as she knelt beside him, pressing trembling fingers to the wound on his collarbone. He gasped, eyes rolling back, and she caught the faint glimmer of fear there, as though he had sensed that this moment his vulnerability had summoned something far more sinister than any illness. Blood seeped between his fingers as he tried to grasp her hand, his trembling more violent now, not from illness, but from the shock of betrayal. Hayley's phone buzzed again in her pocket, Naomi's name glowing on the screen. Without thought, she swiped to answer, voice thick with panic. "Naomi, he's hurt badly. I think someone attacked him." On the other end, Naomi, hundreds of miles away, stood frozen in her small apartment, phone pressed to her ear, crumpled adoption papers in hand. "Hayley, what are you saying? Is Papa okay?" Her words were a lifeline in the void. But Hayley's grip on hope slipped as she heard another sound behind her, the soft scrape of a footstep on hardwood. She turned, panic-stricken, to see the cloaked figure emerge from the darkness, blade raised. The lamp flickered, casting grotesque shadows across the room. "Hayley," Bill rasped, voice weak but urgent. "Run, call Naomi, get out." His words were cut short as the figure advanced. Hayley backed toward the desk, dragging Bill's phone from his jacket pocket, shoving it against her ear. "Naomi, they're here," she shrieked. In that moment, the attacker lunged, and Hayley's cry transformed into a strangled scream. The phone slipped from her tongue, caught between her teeth, and clattered to the wooden floor as the world tilted into a whirlwind of pain and confusion. Naomi heard the scream first, a sharp, visceral sound that froze her blood, then the sickening thud of flesh meeting force, followed by Hayley's voice strangled in a final, desperate gasp. And then silence. Naomi staggered back from her apartment wall, heart hammering. She screamed again, a sound of such raw terror that it seemed impossible for it to emanate from a single person. The line went dead. Naomi's lungs burned, her vision blurred with tears. "Hayley," she whispered, voice cracking. When silence answered, a primal fear seized her. Across the miles, the Hamilton household remained locked in a tableau of violence and secrecy, the chill of midnight deepening around the house, as if the very air conspired to smother any hope of rescue. Unaware of the horror unfolding, Naomi's husband, Mark, called out from the kitchen, asking about dinner. Naomi stumbled toward the living room, hands shaking, as though the ghost of Hayley's scream had imprinted itself on her soul. She sank to the floor, dropping to her knees before the unanswered phone, refusing to believe the static on the line meant Hayley was gone. In her mind, she replayed every word, every hesitation over the past few weeks, Bill's fleeting grimaces, Hayley's sudden late nights at the hospital where she volunteered, her own guilt for not insisting they see a specialist sooner. Somewhere in the constellation of these regrets lurked the reason the attacker had come, not just to harm Bill for a debt owed, but to unravel everything the Hamiltons held dear. Back at the Hamilton residence, the cloaked figure retreated, dragging Hayley's limp form away from the study as Bill clung to consciousness, torn between the searing pain in his side and the need to warn Naomi. He managed to groan, voice ragged, "Naomi, danger," but the words died on his lips as the world went dark. Moments later, Bill awoke on the cold floor, the taste of iron heavy in his mouth, and found himself alone. The study door was ajar, moonlight slicing through the gap, casting long, accusing shadows across the room. He pushed himself up on one elbow, vision blurring, and struggled to his feet, hunching over as dizziness threatened to unsteady him. The front door was wide open, its lock shattered, glass splintered across the foyer. Hayley's car was gone from the drive, suggesting she had been taken, not simply incapacitated. Bill slid to his knees, pressing trembling fingers to the wound on his collarbone, where blood still oozed, a stark reminder that he could barely stand, let alone chase after a merciless assailant. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each inhale a cold shock in his chest. He thought of Naomi, her last scream echoing through his mind, and realized that the nightmare had just begun. As dawn approached, the Hamilton home stood gutted by violence and fear, its inhabitants scattered, some unconscious, others abducted, and all bound by a terror that reached beyond the threshold of what any of them could endure alone. Bill knew he had to act, though every fiber of his being urged him to collapse and surrender to darkness. Drawing on reserves he did not know he possessed, he wrapped a torn piece of Hayley's scarf around his bleeding collarbone, wincing as the fabric clung to his skin. He then forced himself to his feet, clutching at the desk for support, and made his way toward the entryway. His vision swam with vertigo, but his resolve held firm. He would find Hayley, face the cloaked figure who had shattered their lives, and protect Naomi from whatever threat sought to tear their family apart. As he stepped into the foyer, the chill of the morning air bit at his feverish skin, a reminder that help was not coming fast enough. He would have to rely on his wits and the fragments of strength left in his body to pursue the darkness lurking beyond the gates of his home. Meanwhile, Naomi sat in her apartment, clutching the dead phone like a lifeline to a world she feared she had lost forever. Her tears blurred the twilight sky beyond her windows as she dialed the local police on shaking fingers. Each ring of the phone felt like a countdown to irreversible tragedy. 911, what is your emergency? Came the calm voice on the other end. Naomi's answer came in a sob. My father, me stepmother, TV been attacked. I heard everything. Please send someone to 142 Maplewood Lane right now. Though the dispatcher's assurances seemed to echo from a great distance, Naomi held onto them as desperately as she had held onto Bill's flailing hand earlier that night. She couldn't afford to lose hope, not now. Somewhere between the shock and the unsteady breaths, she clung to the fragments of her family's laughter and warmth, determined to believe that beyond these gates, beyond the horrors that had unfolded, lay the possibility of rescue, of justice, and, perhaps, of redemption for all they had hidden behind closed doors. For Bill, Hayley, and Naomi, the morning light would bring revelation and confrontation, a reckoning that promised to unravel long-buried secrets and expose the sinister intent that had invaded their sanctuary. And as the distant wail of sirens grew closer, it carried with it a warning. Once the gates had been breached, the world within would never be the same again. Bill staggered onto the dew-dampened porch, every step sending a jolt of agony through his collarbone. The morning air was sharp against his fevered skin, each breath cradling a promise of both relief and torment. He paused, pressing a trembling hand to the half-mended wound, the makeshift bandage knotted hastily when he fled the study. In the soft daylight, he could see scattering of footprints in the garden soil, one set deep and erratic, the other lighter, as though made by someone who moved swiftly on cat-like toes. The presence of two sets meant that someone else had been there, likely looking for signs of his pursuit or perhaps lying in wait. Bill dropped to one knee, gaze fixed on a broken shard of the front door's antique lock that lay half-buried in the grass. He recognized the pattern of jagged metal from the door's reconstruction, the very same pick he had once used to tinker with locks as a hobby when Naomi was a child. He drew a ragged breath. His breaths came in shallow gulps, cold sweat slicking his brow, but the sight of the broken lock stirred memories of simpler times when he had shown Naomi how he could open any locked chest using nothing but logic and dexterity. How cruel, he thought, that this knowledge now served to remind him of danger rather than delight. He had no time to dwell on nostalgia. Hayley was still missing. His daughter and Dr. Patel would demand answers. But first, he needed to find Hayley. Bill pulled himself up, leaning heavily on the railing. Each movement sent shooting pain through his torso, but he forced himself forward, guided by a mix of paternal fear and the sharp sting of adrenaline. His legs wobbled like newly formed saplings in a storm, but he would not allow weakness to claim him. Taking a moment to steel himself, he scanned the perimeter of the yard. The gloom of the pinewood hedge bordering the property appeared darker than usual, shifting as though someone lurked just inside. Bill swallowed past his nausea. He had never handled a crisis like this, never imagined that an intruder could penetrate the home he had built with his own hands. Though the world feared the unknown, he felt the crushing certainty that the person who attacked them had known exactly who they targeted. First him, then Hayley, possibly hoping to retrieve something buried deeper than any objective secret he had carried for too long. He clenched his jaw and limped toward the west side fence, where the attacker must have fled. At the edge of the lawn, he saw a series of footprints leading toward the side gate. He moved as though wading through molasses, each footstep a negotiation with pain. The image of Hayley's face, her last scream echoing in his ears, spurred him on. This was no random criminal. It was a calculated strike meant to corner him, to strip away his illusions of control. He would find Hayley, and he would retrieve the answers before darkness closed in on all of them. Inside the house, the antiseptic scent of spilled medicinal supplies lingered in the air. Hayley's belongings lay scattered in the foyer, her jacket half on the floor, a delicate gold locket undone, spilling its chain like a silent plea. In the dimness, broken glass from a picture frame glinted, fragments of her smile frozen in glass shards. She had been taken in a whirl of violence, but the moments of capture felt endless. From Bill's flashback, the sensation of impact, the sting on her cheek from a gloved fist, the weight of the hood as it dragged her toward the waiting vehicle. She remembered the muffled sound of wheels crunching gravel as the car sped away, and then darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on a cold, uneven surface. Her hands were bound behind her back with coarse rope, and a strip of cloth had been knotted around her mouth, muffling her cries. The smell of dampness and mildew told her she was somewhere underground or in an abandoned shed. Panic filled her chest, but she focused on calm breathing, strategizing how to escape. Each tethered finger felt swollen, as though the rope had cut off circulation, yet her mind remained sharp. She thought of Naomi. The memory of her daughter's laughter gave her the strength to blink away tears. She forced herself to listen beyond the immediate terror, trying to detect voices, footsteps, or any indication that the attacker remained nearby. She strained her ears against the oppressive silence that pressed in as heavily as the gag on her mouth. Then, A distant metallic creak resonated through the space, each second stretched by fear. It was impossible to know if the sound was a warning her captor's return or something more innocuous, but to Hayley, it heralded impending danger. She closed her eyes, drawing strength from the last recollection of Bill's trembling hand, and steeled herself for whatever lay ahead. Outside, Bill's limping form stumbled through the neighbor's overgrown property, limbs trembling as he followed the tracks that snaked through the wet earth. Every muscle in his body screamed protest, but his determination flared brighter than any physical agony. He recalled the evening before when he had glimpsed his own reflection in the study window, pale, drawn, and with shadows under his eyes that he had once mistaken for mere fatigue. He had known that his secret, his illness, would one day bring him low. He had chosen to keep it hidden, believing that a confession would alarm his family more than any attempt at concealment. Yet concealment had only delayed the inevitable. Now, faced with a foe who cared little for his frailty, he recognized with bitter clarity that deception had become a liability as lethal as any blade. As he reached the back fence, he paused to catch his breath, leaning against the coarse wood. He studied the footprints that led onward, deeper into the woods. He had no weapon aside from a half-broken flashlight from his study's desk, the battery flickering weakly. He considered turning back to call for help, but the thought of Hayley alone in captivity rooted him in place. He flicked the flashlight on, its feeble beam revealing more sets of footprints, 3 distinct pairs now, fanning out through the muck like the fingers of some malignant hand. To his right, a pair of boots registered deeper and slower, as though the wearer waded through thick underbrush. To his left, another pair was lighter, the tread of someone running. Bill understood then that he was not merely tracking one assailant, but perhaps 2 or even 3, each with their own agenda and knowledge of his secret. Panic flickered, but he swallowed it down. The moment that thought of giving in came, he banished it. He would fight, step by step, until he either saved Hayley or collapsed trying. With a gulp of ragged determination, he pressed forward, the hush of dawn enveloping him like a shroud. Meanwhile, Naomi sat slumped on the floor of her apartment, her phone still warm in her hand. The dispatcher's muffled questions and reassurances had looped in her mind, but the picture was horrifically incomplete. She did not know if Bill was alive. She did not know if Hayley was alive. Her breath caught in her throat at the memory of that final scream. Although the police had promised someone will be there soon, Naomi felt the hours stretch into eternity, as though time itself had slowed to watch her desperation. She rose unsteadily, brushing crumbs of cold coffee cake from the coffee table. She paced toward the window, each blink a punishment, convinced she might catch sight of a police cruiser racing down Maplewood Lane. But there were only the faint outlines of buildings, the pale glow of streetlights reluctant to surrender today. She sank into the armchair and after a moment's hesitation dialed Mark, her husband. He answered on the second ring, groggy. "Naomi? It's early." What? She cut him off. "They attacked Papa. They took Hayley," she blurted, tears breaking loose. "I heard the whole thing. I don't know where they are. Please, Mark, call the hospital. Call anyone. I can't sit here." Mark's voice steadied as he sat up in bed. "Okay. I'm calling Dr. Patel now. We're going to figure this out, honey." Naomi clung to his words, but guilt gnawed at her for relying on someone to fix this. She had always believed she could protect her family with clear thinking and decisive action. Now she felt helpless. She closed her eyes, remembering her father's reassuring hugs from years gone by, and let herself fall apart for the first time since she'd heard Hayley's name called in terror. At that same moment, Hayley's captor returned, a tall figure whose boots scraped the concrete as he approached. He knelt before her, removing the gag, his face still hidden in the black folds of his hood. He spoke to her in a low, gravelly voice, almost apologetic. "Do not try anything foolish. You'll only make it worse for you and your daughter." Fear coiled in Hayley's chest, but she refused to show tremors that might betray her strategy. She let her voice come out calm and gathered. "What do you want?" she asked, voice steady but laced with steel. He hesitated before answering, as though weighing her worth. "Your husband told you a lie," he said finally, each word measured. "And now a debt must be paid." The cryptic remark sent fresh waves of dread crashing through her. She forced her mind to remember everything Bill had said about his secret ailment, how he had been slipping into something he refused to define. Was the illness related to money owed? Or was it something far more personal? She tried to make him look at her, but his gaze remained fixed on the floor, shadowed by the hood. When he turned abruptly and walked away, Hayley reeled at the implication that Bill's disease was somehow connected to this attack, as though his decisions had invited violence into their home. Determination flared within her. The moment he left her alone, she began testing the strength of her restraints, flexing her wrists until the rope cut into her skin. She refused to weep or lose hope, clinging to the memory of Naomi's sweet face, believing that family would be her pathway to survival. Outside, Bill's pursuit grew more desperate. He had followed the tracks through brambles and thorns until he stumbled upon a narrow dirt path hidden beneath fallen leaves, as though someone had tried to obscure their passing. The path led to the remnants of what had once been a small boathouse by the river. Its decaying wooden boards sagged under the weight of years, the doors hanging open like jaws, inviting peril. Bill's fevered mind recognized he had no choice but to proceed. He eased himself into the boathouse's threshold, blinking against the dimness inside. The air was dank, laced with the odor of stagnant water and rust. He heard a faint noise, Hayley's ragged breathing coming from the far corner, where a knot of rope tied around a wooden post held her upright. Bill's heart pounded so fiercely he thought he might collapse. Elation and fear battled for supremacy within him. He lurched forward, and the floor gave a groan beneath his weight, echoing through the boathouse like a distant thunderclap. Hayley's head snapped up at the sound, and relief washed across her face when she saw him, though tears welled immediately. "Bill," she whispered, pain and relief mingling in her voice. Bill ignored the agony in his shoulder, hurried to her side, and worked at the knot. As he tugged, fragments of her ordeal spilled out: how the captor had stolen her watch, how he had kept her bound in darkness, making her listen to the ebb and flow of the river as though time itself conspired to keep her isolated. Bill's chest constricted at her words. He freed her wrist first, then the other, and gently pulled the gag away. Hayley gasped for air, every breath a gift. She closed her eyes, letting the tears flow, tears of gratitude and terror. Bill pressed his forehead against hers, as though willing her to be safe by sheer force of his will. But their reunion was interrupted by a distant sound, the crunch of gravel under tires, engines idling outside, and the murmur of voices. Bill realized with a jolt that the captor had not returned alone. He'd brought the police. He fished in his pocket for his phone, dialing Naomi's number, praying she had an update. As it rang, Hayley leaned on him, drawing strength from his closeness. "I heard you calling," Bill said, voice hushed but urgent. "Naomi." "Papa, Mommy." Naomi's voice trembled through the speaker. "They're at the house, but Dr. Patel said they'd send someone to help you. Are you okay?" Relief and guilt flooded Bill. "We're safe for now," he whispered. "Just come quickly." He ended the call and looked through the boathouse window. Flickering lights from police cruisers cut through the morning mist, painting the walls in red and blue. He helped Hayley to her feet, each movement a fresh pang, but the sight of officers fanning out across the bank filled him with hope. Hayley leaned on his shoulder, and together they hobbled toward the back door, where two officers stood with weapons drawn. Both she and Bill called out simultaneously, startling the officers, who rushed to them, offering blankets and first aid. Bill's relief was tempered by fresh questions. How had the captor known where to bring Hayley? Was the police presence enough to keep them safe? And where did Naomi stand in all of this? He wanted to reassure his daughter that they were home free, but he knew better than to offer false comfort. Meanwhile, Naomi threw herself into action. She waited by her car in the driveway, fingers clenching and unclenching the steering wheel as she watched red and blue lights dance through the neighborhood. The police had triaged her father's wound. Dr. Patel, who had arrived at the scene before the ambulance, had pronounced the injury non-life-threatening but warned that Bill's underlying illness warranted immediate hospitalization. Naomi's heart twisted, knowing that her father had concealed his condition for so long. She remembered the way he had refused her pleas to see specialists and how she had assumed it was merely pride or fear of medical bills. She had not realized the tremor in his hand was more than a sign of fatigue. When the officers finally gestured for her to approach, she leapt from the car, rushing forward to embrace them both. Hayley's face was drawn but alive, tears sliding down her cheeks as she clutched Naomi's arms. Bill gave a weary smile, his once imposing frame now a silhouette of vulnerability. Naomi's tears pooled, guilt and relief interweaving as she touched his cheek, feeling the warmth of his feverish skin. I thought I lost you," she whispered. Bill squeezed her hand, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I'm here, baby. Let's just get inside." They were ushered into the patrol car first, where an officer draped a blanket around Hayley's shoulders, keeping her warm against the cold breeze. As they drove toward the hospital, Naomi sat between her parents in the back seat, arms around them both, as though anchoring them to a reality that threatened to slip away. Her mind raced with questions she needed to ask. Why had Bill's illness become so severe? Who wanted to harm them so violently? And did the attack stem from something he had done, or from something she had missed? In the sterile brightness of the hospital corridor, Dr. Patel guided them to an examining room. Bill was whisked away for imaging tests, his collarbone rechecked and his tremor monitored as though it held coded messages about his immediate survival. Hayley sat beside Naomi, holding her hand, her own wrist still sore from the binding. Naomi watched her mother's hand cradling hers, realizing how fragile that bond could be when tested by secrets and violence. She wanted to ask Hayley about the captor's cryptic remark what lie had Bill told, but Hayley was too exhausted, her gaze distant, as though she replayed the words in a loop, trying to make sense of them. A nurse hovered, offering hot tea in a styrofoam cup, scent of peppermint promising a small comfort. Naomi wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the steam rise between her palms. The tension between them was thick, questions that refused to be asked, confessions that refused to be made. At that moment, all three Hamiltons recognized that the night's events had fractured their world in ways that could not be mended with mere medical bandages or kind words. A deeper wound yawned between them, one born of secrecy and unspoken fears. When Bill returned, supported by two orderlies, Naomi sprang forward. She examined his face, noting the flush of fever that lingered despite the cooling blankets. He looked older, lines etched more deeply around his eyes, shoulders stooped, as though the simple act of standing required concentrated effort. "Will they let me go home?" he asked, voice brittle. Dr. Patel emerged from the adjoining room, adjusting his glasses, face grave but sympathetic. "Your x-rays show a mild fracture near the clavicle. We can treat that here with a sling and pain management. Your tremor is more concerning, though. I want to run some neurological tests and get you to see a specialist as soon as possible. The fall likely aggravated whatever underlying condition you have." Bill nodded, swallowing hard. Naomi reached for his hand, squeezing it. "Dad, why didn't you tell us?" His gaze flicked toward Hayley, who met his eyes with sorrow that cut deeper than any blade. "I was ashamed, scared," he admitted. "I didn't want to burden you or Hayley. I convinced myself I could handle it alone." Naomi's throat tightened. "You should never bear it alone," she whispered. Hayley's eyes glistened. "We would have helped you. We would have faced it together. Tension lingered, but for the first time, the walls of deception trembled on the brink of collapse. As Bill was escorted to a hospital room, the three of them lingered in the hallway. The corridor lights hummed overhead, and the distant beeps of monitors formed a mechanical lullaby. Naomi realized that their unity now depended on truths about Bill's health, about the motives behind the attack, and about the debts, metaphorical or otherwise, that he had concealed. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this," she said firmly. Bill stared at her for a moment, searching her eyes for forgiveness. "I promise," he said, voice trembling. "I swear I will tell you everything." Hayley stepped forward, resting her hand on his other shoulder. "You don't have to promise alone," she said. "We'll face it together." In that instant, the vulnerability that had once isolated each of them became the bond that would carry them forward. Despite the darkness that had invaded their home, they found hope in one another's honesty. The unknown lay before them, the identity of their assailants still hidden, the full extent of Bill's illness still undiagnosed, but they would no longer walk that path apart. As they departed down the hallway, rising in their wake was the faint echo of distant sirens, bidding them to remember that danger and healing often traveled side by side. Together, they would forge a future beyond the gates of betrayal, facing each secret head-on and confronting the shadows that had threatened to consume them.